Hello, I'm Nancy Guerra, Dean of the School of Social Ecology. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our Parkside Chat. The idea of the Parkside Chats is to bring our faculty expertise to bear on some of the challenges we all face in understanding and coping with the effects of COVID-19. So we're here today with Dr. Susan Charles, who is a clinical psychologist and an expert in aging and health. And we all know that COVID-19 is particularly challenging for the senior population. And so Dr. Charles is going to talk a bit with us about some of these challenges and then suggest some strategies for helping older people or for younger people with older parents, for helping the older population understand and cope with COVID-19. So welcome, Dr. Charles.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Maybe we can start. I know something that has come to mind is this whole idea of 65 and over being a cut score. So if someone is 66, they're worried, and if someone is 64, they're not worried. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you define the parameters of aging, and is it just your straight chronological age that you need to think about, or do we think of aging a little bit differently?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and often I hear in the media questions about older people versus not older people. It seems a very black and white issue, and in fact it's really not. That aging represents a concept that could be a biological aging or a social aging, and so people have different patterns and different timelines for what happens to their lives and how long they live and how healthy they are. So you can have a very vibrant 75-year-old who ran the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours in his incredible condition, and you can find a 47-year-old in a nursing home. So as far as health, we can't necessarily predict from your age what your health is going to be or what your susceptibility to this virus will be, what your social life is like, what your marital status is like. In fact, it's a lot easier to predict what a young person is like than an older person because they have all this life history and this health history that makes them much more complex and different from one another.
So there's a lot of variation, you would say, within the aging population. Just because you're 66 doesn't mean that you should be extremely worried. All of us, of course, need to be cautious, but sounds like it's important to just consider your overall health as well as just your chronological age, as well as the context that you live in. So if you have friends, if you have connections, a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. That's good advice. So let's start. I know you think about health very broadly. It's not just physical health. I know for many people, when you say health, they think about just their physical health and are they sick? But you really have a much more comprehensive way of thinking about health. So why don't you tell our audience a bit about how you think about health?
Yes, there's many ways to define health, and so I'll just give you a brief summary and then we can talk about each one in more detail later. But there's what we hear most about these days, which is our physical health, especially in line with this virus. There's also mental health, which can include our emotional well-being, our psychological well-being. It can also include our cognitive health, which is the idea of our minds thinking clearly and well. We also have something else I'm going to talk about today, and that's financial health and having a healthy financial outlook. So there's a lot of different ways of measuring and understanding health, and they're also intertwined from one another. So it's very hard to have high levels of emotional well-being when our physical health is not good. And we also notice, for example, that our physical health directly affects how well our brain works. And so all of these are intertwined.
Oh, that's really good to know. So maybe we should start by talking a little bit about just physical health. So what are some of the challenges of COVID-19? What can people do to really kind of protect their physical health? What would you recommend?
Yes, that's a great question. And what we hear most of all is protecting from the virus. So making sure that we do not, we're not exposed and our loved ones are not exposed to the virus. And so understanding that and the need for physical distancing at this time. There's also the idea that we need to stay as healthy as we can. And so the short-term goal of making sure, or however long it lasts, to not expose ourselves to the virus is very, very important. But I also want to mention the other end of this, which is keeping healthy. And so, for example, maintaining your chronic illnesses that you do have. If you're taking medication, to stay on that medication. If people run out of their medication, to talk to their doctors and make sure that they get those refilled. To get proper exercise and sleep, and making sure that their overall health is as robust as it can be in this situation. Especially staying at home is hard to exercise. So we need to make sure we optimize our own health in addition to protecting ourselves from exposure to the virus.
That's an interesting kind of idea that I've heard people talk about, is that we do have a little more time. We're not commuting to work. We're not going out to different events. So why not use the time to really optimize our physical health? And if we're cooking, cook healthy foods. We are allowed to be outside, so get more exercise. I know where I live, we call ourselves the walkers because there are people out walking 3 times a day. So in some ways you can use it as an opportunity. And if you have a goal, one of our experts talked about the importance of setting goals in this. All of the ambiguity creates uncertainty, but if you say my goal is to get healthy, to exercise, to eat healthy, whatever it is, during this time, that also gives you kind of a motivation and a focus. So I think, interestingly, we can use this as a time to actually improve our health.
Absolutely, and to accept the idea that we might be indoors more than we'd like, but to get these small goals that we can achieve currently, and also have these long-term goals of when we're able to move around or to travel more. What is that goal, and what do we have to do physically to get in shape for that ultimate goal?
So let me follow up on another question related to what you were talking about in terms of protecting yourself. I know, particularly for people who are grandparents, I've heard from a lot of my friends, I'm a grandparent, the hardest thing is not seeing your grandchildren. That seems to be just a huge struggle. Do you have a sense of when it would be safe to see grandchildren, or should seniors really just stay away from grandchildren for a long while?
That's a good question, and I wish I knew the answer. So it really depends on what the epidemiologists and virologists have to tell us about that. It's also very hard because children under 5 don't really understand this physical distancing. So when they see grandma, or grandpa, they want to run up and give them big bear hugs. And so understanding what's right for your family, or who lives with whom, and what that physical distancing looks like is very hard. So it really depends.
Well, we're back now. We've moved out of the rain. Our hair's a little bit wet, but we're no worse for the wear. And we want to resume our conversation. We were talking about the mental effects and coping strategies, and let's talk a little bit about the cognitive effects and how those play out and what we can do.
So as far as cognitive, and by cognitive we mean how we think, how we remember events. So there's been a lot of research showing that keeping our brains mentally fit and sharp requires engaging. And so we want people to remain engaged. Watching TV is actually not related to cognitive functioning. In fact, it's actually the opposite. The more people watch TV, we notice there's a correlation between lower cognitive functioning, so what we call kind of poor memory and poor thoughts. And so we need people to stay engaged. And the more complex the activity they do, the better for their brain. So, for example, types of activities.
Like puzzles?
Puzzles are good, and crossword puzzles are good too, but actually something that requires people to remember in order to do it. So, for example, Craig Stark here on the UCI campus showed very compelling research that playing video games and learning a new video game actually is very good for the older person's brain. So playing video games, conversations, social engagement is a lot more cognitively complex than we assume. You have to think of the right words to say. You might try to be convincing someone of something, or just expressing a thought. And so having conversations that are complex, that are thoughtful, that also includes a cognitive component. We also, reading is more engaging than something like passively watching something. So all these activities, in addition, it's doing a lot of different activities is also helpful. So switching it up. So We find that good.
Great. We also realize, of course, that online is critical, and being able to use Zoom or the internet. In aging populations, how difficult or challenging of a task is it to actually learn how to use the internet if you don't know how, or learn how to use Zoom?
Yes, and so that's a really great question. So we know the internet in one way or the other has been part of our lives for like the last 15 years. And so some older adults are just great at the internet, and they easily can learn how to incorporate new technology. Other people are not great at it, and maybe they've always been bad at it, but other people have refused to learn. So it really depends on the person. Another problem that we see is that sometimes someone who would have been fine doing this 10 or 15 years ago, you give them something new, and they're having a hard time picking it up. What you might be picking up there is underlying cognitive problems that you might not have noticed, because they can do all the normal routine activities in their daily life without you noticing any kind of change in their memory or change in their ability to learn new information. But if you give them a new challenge, you might be uncovering something that's been kind of insidious and building up that you didn't notice before. So if you find yourself being really frustrated that your 75-year-old grandfather can't use Zoom, you just have to remember, well, that might be a memory problem that they've had.
Well, and I think there's simpler technology, so FaceTime's a lot easier. If people have phones, and I've been amazed at how many people of all ages have phones, and they can just use FaceTime, that allows them to talk with you. I mean, it's really, in a lot of ways, it's so fortunate that we have access to all these technologies. I can't imagine, had this happened 50 years ago, we would have had no connections with other people at all. So I think as much as we can help older people use technology, that's going to be really important. Are there some new apps coming out maybe for seniors, like Zoom Made Easy, or Zoom for Zoomers, or Zoom for Boomers and beyond? Well, I don't know.
People have...
like with Alexa.
Right, and Alexa's a great example. Alexa, just also the way people are designing for older eyes, and so making things bigger and clearer to use. Making touch screens, making them more interactive. So people are definitely thinking of technology with aging in mind.
How they can do that. That's great to know. Well, let's turn now to financial health, because that's something we infrequently hear people talk about when they talk about health. And I agree. I think it's critically important. I know my father-in-law got scammed because he was lonely, and he was a very friendly person, and people would call on the phone and talk to him and give him a great opportunity to make $50,000 by investing $5,000, and he would give them his credit card. And that was when he was still married and his wife was home and he went out and he wasn't lonely. So I can only imagine now how vulnerable people might be. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, your story captures a lot of the components that we see in research. For example, someone who calls, who's charming and captures somebody who might be feeling a little lonely, a little isolated, who wants to talk to somebody on the phone. And so if someone doesn't get a lot of attention, and then all of a sudden someone who's very nice and is calling them and engaging them, that is something we see, that fraudsters do that. They'll call older adults. We know that they target older adults. They generally have more money, and even the people who don't. So we see really two groups that are most vulnerable: the older, educated men, and actually women who don't have a lot of money at all. And people will call pretending to be their grandchildren, for example. They'll say, "Hey, Grandma, don't you recognize who I am?" And then the older person will say, "Oh, is this?" and say a name, and they'll say yes, and they'll say, "Well, I need money. Can you wire me money?" And so they'll pull at the heartstrings and the compassion. Older adults often are very generative and want to help others, and so scammers will call and talk about the desperate need for money of a certain group of people. Also, older people don't realize how much information you can get just off the web about them, or going through their trash. So people will call and they'll say, "I'm from your bank," and they'll know what bank they have, and they'll know who they live with, or if they don't live with anyone else, they'll know their age, and they will say there's something wrong with your account. Let's look at this together, and have older people give away that information. They also have older people, they'll call them up, and maybe one of you has had this call where they'll say, hey, there's something wrong with your computer. We're doing this online problem solving, and so they'll get older people to log on and work with them on their computer, especially if older people are a little nervous that they don't know how to use their computer, and then they're in the computer, they've downloaded some software and passwords, and they have all their passwords and their access to their bank account and all their personal information. So just making sure that you talk to people and say, oh, who have you talked to on the phone lately? Just making sure you're aware of what's going on with older adults. We're all susceptible to this, but older adults are often the target. They're more likely to pick up the phone. And so, and there's some research to show that they're also more likely, once they pick up the phone, to become a victim of a scam. So be careful.
I know I had a friend whose mother was called, and I think this story is also common, told that the grandson was being kidnapped in Mexico and she needed to wire $30,000 in the next 3 hours or he would be killed. And she panicked and she ran to she had a credit union. I didn't know this, but banks will check it, but credit unions don't. She ran to the credit union and wired $30,000, and it was just a scam. So I think the lesson learned is, for older people or for people with older parents, absolutely do not give out any information on the phone to anyone you don't know.
Yes.
Talk to them and whatever, but you have to have, your default is, do not give out anything, do not give anyone access. Understand what scams are, maybe talk with older parents. I get the IRS, this is the IRS, and we're gonna file a lawsuit against you if you don't pay within 3 hours. I'm like, the IRS doesn't call on the phone. Sometimes I know enough to say, do you not feel bad doing this? Because I get it, but you're gonna get an older person who's gonna do it.
And the IRS, Medicare, cheap prescriptions, so they really prey. Also, even people who don't have a lot of money. So you hear about scams where they call people and ask for just donations of $20. And so every day it's another $20, or every week it's another $20 to some bogus foundation that sounds like you're helping someone with children that need help, or animals rescue, or cancer foundations that don't exist. Yeah. And you'll just see this little chipping away of their savings. So even people who don't have a lot of money are really at risk.
So that's great advice. And it's probably worthwhile, if you have elder parents who live by themselves, to sit down and talk with them, and maybe even give them a list in big print. Do not talk to these people. Do not give your credit card, or even put some kind of a $100 cap on their credit cards, or notice to the bank not to let them wire any money. I know with my father-in-law, we were kind of aware of that problem after he went, he spent the first $5,000, but his wife really didn't want to take his credit card away because he did buy other things, and she didn't want him to feel that he was a child, that he couldn't have a credit card. And that cost us another $15,000. So I think at some point you just have to, right? You just have to say, hey, we're going to put a $100 cap on your credit card, or fraud alert at any $100 or more expense.
It's a really tricky question, because a lot of older people don't want to be told and don't want that sense of control removed from them. So, but you're absolutely right. It is a danger. And so just make sure that you talk to them, ask who you talked to today, or talk about how it's wonderful to help people in need, but talk about what they're doing. So
we'll decide on our own. We don't respond to any request. We decide what we want to do. And maybe if your parents or you yourself are like that, sit down and decide what you want to donate to. There's certainly plenty of causes right now and plenty of need. And then you can tell people, which is what I always do. I say, I give generously, but I choose who I want to give to. I don't just react to a call.
Or volunteer to help kind of investigate this and see it. They could be actually very important and real organizations, or they can be just money that goes into the hands of fraudsters. So
Right.
you just want to make sure.
And there's some good organizations that tell you what the best charities are to give to. So you could work with those or work with your parents on those. So you've given us fabulous advice about physical health, about mental health, cognitive functioning, as well as financial health. Do you have some closing words of wisdom for people? And then we invite everybody to come and participate in our live chat with you. But what would be your closing words of wisdom?
So I just want to say that with all these healths, this is something that is not age specific. And so you might say, hey, I'm a 30-something or I'm a 40-something, and I think emotional health and my well-being is very important, and it is. So all these areas of health are important at every age. That an older person has a lot of the same desires and feelings and a lot of connections that we all do. So we need to be aware of all these areas of health regardless of what age we are.
That's fantastic. So I hope you can join us for a question and answer and think of some other questions you might want to ask. I know in our previous webinars, we get a lot of very specific questions. So my 68-year-old mother wants to do this. What should I do? Those are fine, and those are going to be the most useful for you.
And sometimes the most interesting for me, too. So I do like that.
Yeah, no, and it's a great topic, so thanks for being here.
All right.
And now it's starting to blow rain this way, so I think it's time to wrap up. We're getting rained on even undercover.